Okay, here we go. 1912 Home Rule Crisis, we know. Very important event in Irish history. So let's go through this as quickly as we can. So we're talking about the... Let me do something here really quickly. We're talking about the early 20th century. Don't forget, by the early 20th century, Ireland um, was not an independent country. We were part of the British Empire. And you've looked at your plantations, you've looked at your 1798 rebellion, you've looked at your history of the famine, you've looked at your home rule, Parnell and Redmond sections of your paper, of your course. So you'll know that by the time we got to the early 20th century, Ireland was really divided between a population of somewhere around between 75 and 80% nationalists who were mainly Catholic, who wanted Ireland to be an independent nation and have its own parliament back and go away from the Act of Union, and about between 25 and 20% of the population who were unionists, which meant that they wanted to maintain the Act of Union, which had been in place since 1801, in which Ireland's Parliament was closed, and Irish MPs went to London to take their seats. And these were mainly from, not exclusively, but mainly from the Protestant population. And the primary reason, we'll come to it in a second, but the primary reason for unionist objections to the idea of Home Rule or an Irish Parliament in Dublin was because of fears of religious discrimination. So there we have the nationalists. If you're asked what a nationalist is, they were the majority of the population. Most of them voted for Home Rule, which was a parliament for Ireland. The Home Rule Party, they were officially called the Irish Parliamentary Party, but they were known as the Home Rule Party because they were a single issue party. They were led by John Redmond by this period of the first decade of the 20th century, and they wanted an Irish Parliament in Dublin. That's what they wanted, a Parliament in Dublin for Ireland to make decisions about Ireland. Unionists, they were a minority of the population, mostly located in Ulster, but by no means only. There were unionists all over Ireland, but the large majority were located in North East in Ulster. They feared discrimination based on their religion. That's called sectarian discrimination. They voted for the Unionist Party, and their leader from around this time was Edward Carson, and most Unionists were Protestant. But as I said, with the Nationalists, not all Unionists were Protestant. There were some Catholic Unionists. In Britain at the time, really where decisions were made about Ireland, there were two main political parties. The Conservative Party were against Home Rule for Ireland. The Liberal Party were in favour of Home Rule for Ireland. The Conservatives were led by a lad called Andrew Bonar Law, and the Liberals were led by a lad called Herbert Asquith. In 1911, the Liberals were in power. They were in power with support from the Home Rule Party in what's called a coalition government. Don't forget, as I said, the Home Rule Party were a single issue party, so there was only one thing they wanted, and what they wanted was Home Rule. So in order for them to go into government to support the Liberals and Asquith in government, they said, okay, well, Herbert, give us Home Rule. So Herbert agreed. And the Liberals voted in order to give Ireland a Home Rule Bill, which basically was a new law which would grant Ireland a parliament in Dublin. And this was the third time that this idea of a Home Rule Bill was introduced into the Parliament in London. And the reason it had to happen three times is because the first two times failed. There was a Home Rule Bill in 1886. If you've studied Parnell, you'll know that. In 1892, on both occasions, the law didn't pass the Parliament because they were blocked. In 1886, it was the Liberals themselves rebelled against their leader. In 1892, the Liberals passed it in the House of Commons, but the House of Lords, which is the second House of Parliament in the UK, if you pass a law in the Commons, it also has to then be passed in the House of Lords. Think about it. If mum agrees, dad might have to agree as well, or if dad agrees, mum might have to agree as well. It's kind of like that. The crucial thing is the House of Lords had a power of veto. Okay, and the House of Lords' power of veto was used by its majority, who were Conservatives. Now remember what I said? The Conservatives, they were against Home Rule for Ireland. So even if the Liberals had a majority in the House of Commons and they passed the bill, it had to go into the House of Lords, where the House of Lords could block it as many times as they wanted. That's called the right of veto. And because the House of Lords was dominated by Conservatives, it seemed as if Ireland would never get Home Rule, because even if the Liberals and the Irish nationalist, the Home Rule Party, did pass a bill in the Parliament, in the House of Commons, it would never get through the House of Lords veto. But then something happened which changed everything. And it happened in British politics. In 1909, the Liberal Party were in power and they introduced what was called the People's Budget, which is essentially, very complicated, but essentially what they wanted to do was pay for things like social welfare, unemployment, assistance, healthcare, free healthcare for citizens, to pay for, new schools for poor people who couldn't afford to pay. And in order to get the money to pay for all those new things, they needed to tax the rich. Okay? And the rich were didn't want to pay more tax, and the party of the rich were the Conservatives. So what happened was David Lloyd George was the man in charge of finances. It's called the Chancellor of the Exchequer in the UK. He introduced his bill for new taxes on the rich. The House of Lords vetoed that bill, which meant that government couldn't function because government had no budget and government couldn't get money. This led to a fear of revolution in the UK or in Britain, in England, where poor people who felt that they had voted for change were having their change blocked by a very small group of really rich people. They felt there was a fear there could be a communist or socialist uprising, and the king intervened. His name was George V, and he said if the House of Lords continued to refuse to pass the budget, then he would just introduce loads of new lords. And they'd be, because he's able to do that, he's the fellow who makes people lords. And if he did that, then the Conservatives would be in a minority in the House of Lords. So the Conservatives gave in. But when they gave in, they had to agree to another new law called the Parliament Act. And this is where it ties into Ireland. The Parliament Act said that the power of veto, which up until this time the House of Lords had unlimited, that the power of veto would be limited to 2 passings of a law. In other words, if the House of Commons votes to pass a law once and it goes to the House of Lords can veto it. If the House of Commons go back and vote for that law again twice, then the House of Lords could veto it. But if the House of Commons came back a third time, clearly showing it was the will of the people, because the House of Commons was directly elected by the people, then the House of Lords could not veto it. Now, that was huge for Ireland. Huge for Ireland. Because in 1912, as I said, Herbert Asquith and John Redmond, their two parties combined to form a government, and they introduced the Third Home Rule Bill, which was immediately vetoed by the House of Lords. But in Ireland, there were huge celebrations because the Parliament Act meant that we would get Home Rule by 1914, because we know they vetoed it in 1912, and the Parliament Act said they could veto it again the next year. It took about a year for a law to get through the processes of Parliament. 1913 they could block it again, but 1914 they couldn't block it, so Ireland would have its own Parliament after 100 years and more of rule from London. And there was huge celebrations in Dublin amongst nationalists. This feeling that in the past we went for fighting and bloodshed and killing, 1798 and 1848 and 1867. There were all these rebellions and none of them worked. We never got our freedom. But here we'd taken our time, we'd been patient, we had used democracy, and we'd achieved our goal. There was a huge sense of satisfaction in amongst nationalists. But of course, the exact opposite amongst unionists, who had felt completely secure that Home Rule would never happen. Their worst nightmare would never happen because the House of Lords had the power of veto. 1912 happens, Home Rule Bill is introduced, and the unionists went absolutely off the charts, really, really angry. Their leader said that they would fight, and Andrew Bonar Law, the Conservative leader in the UK, supported them, and he famously said, Ulster will fight and Ulster will be right. And that was a very, very famous slogan from the unionists. So what did they do? How did they react? Well, on the 28th of September 1912, Ulster Day occurred. This was a day when unionists came out to show their opposition to Home Rule. They organised a petition, which is a collection of signatures or a form of protest. That petition was called a Solemn League and Covenant. Solemn means serious. League means we're all in this together. Covenant is a promise to God. And the Solemn League and Covenant said, we promise to God that we will unite to fight against Home Rule. They organised an army to resist Home Rule called the Ulster Volunteer Force, and immediately set about training that army and setting up um, uh, and arming them and getting them ready for a civil war that seemed to be looming, because in 1913, in response to the formation of the Ulster Volunteer Force in Dublin, the Irish Volunteer Force was founded by Owen MacNeill, and nationalists said, well, hold on a minute, we were good boys, we did all the things we were supposed to do, we were patient, this is a democratic decision of the government, of the Parliament in London, we're getting our own Parliament, you're not going to stop us by behaving in a way which is threatening violence. So if you're going to fight against Home Rule, we're going to fight to keep it. So it looked like Ireland was going to have a civil war in 1914 when the Home Rule Bill became law. But of course it never happened, because over far, far, far away, in a place that most people in Ireland had never heard of, called Sarajevo, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, his name was Archduke Franz Ferdinand, was shot in a bizarre set of circumstances by a Serbian nationalist called Gavrilo Princip, and that sparked off a series of events which led to the outbreak of the First World War. And of course, Britain said, well, hold on a minute, we can't have Ireland separating away from the rest of England during wartime, so Home Rule was postponed. And there you go, that's the 1912 Home Rule crisis. I hope it makes sense.